Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero. Thank you for joining us. It is day 13 of the Derek Chauvin murder trial in Minneapolis. That trial has just broken for a lunch recess. For a second consecutive day, the defense is calling witnesses to discuss what they believe were the contributing factors that led to George Floyd's death. The former Minneapolis police officer faces multiple charges, including murder and manslaughter for Floyd's death in May of 2020. Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck, back, and side for more than 9 minutes during an arrest. Today's first witness was Dr. David Fowler. He is the former chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland. Chauvin's attorneys are trying to convince the jury that Floyd's drug use and underlying heart disease led to his death, not just his struggle with police that day.
How did the heart and drugs contribute to the cause of death?
They were significant, or they contributed to Mr. Floyd having a sudden cardiac arrest, in my opinion. That's how I would read it. In my opinion, Mr. Floyd had a sudden cardiac arrhythmia due to his atherosclerotic and hypertensive heart disease, or you can write that down multiple different ways. During his restraint and subdual by the police, or restraint by the police.
We should note the judge presiding over this case, Peter Cahill, already turned down a defense request to acquit Chauvin earlier today, rejecting claims that prosecutors failed to prove Chauvin's actions killed George Floyd. For more on this, let's bring in Sarah Davis. She's the executive director of the Legal Rights Center, and she joins us from Minneapolis. Sarah, welcome. Great to have you with us. What are your initial thoughts so far on day 13 of testimony? Do you believe the defense is getting what it needs out of this particular witness we just heard from, considering all the defense needs to do is convince one juror, in essence, to have the result of a hung jury?
Thanks so much for having me. I think my perspective on how today has played out, and quite frankly, how the entire defense has played out throughout this trial, is that it's been relatively ineffective. I think, we'll get a better sense at the end of today, after this witness goes through cross-examination this afternoon, about how effective his testimony really could be. But I think overall, the defense has been ineffective because it has been relatively disingenuous throughout. It started with their opening statement, where they tried to paint a picture that the crowd was distracting Derek Chauvin from his care of George Floyd. It's incredibly disingenuous to suggest that what Derek Chauvin was doing to George Floyd would constitute care. And it's sort of continued throughout. Even today, I listened to Dr. Fowler talk about the CO2 emission from the car, which just felt very implausible. And then some testimony about the obstruction of the airway, that wouldn't be obstructed because the knee was on the back of the neck, not the front. Particularly in light of the testimony we heard previously from Dr. Chauvin, I believe was his name for the prosecution. I just think there's this theme running throughout the defense of being pretty disingenuous. And that's a problem. When you're in front of a jury, you need to have some credibility. And,
just putting ourselves in the shoes of the defense lawyers for a moment, during this trial, we've seen some very highly qualified medical professionals give some testimonies that seem to contradict each other. On the one hand, we've heard that Floyd died as a result of asphyxiation due to a lack of oxygen. On the other, we hear that he perhaps died of an underlying heart issue exacerbated by his drug use. Those are both very different causes of death. So, as the defense, how do you navigate this, knowing that the jury has already heard a week's worth of testimony for the prosecution?
I've been a practicing defense attorney for over 13 years, and this is part of the job. You can expect that by the time you get your chance to present your witnesses, that there's been testimony presented that is not helpful to your theory of the case. But that's why throughout the process, your job is really to build your credibility with the jury, build credibility for your theory of the case. And I think in this case, as I mentioned earlier, the defense really hasn't done that because at the end of the day, the jury is going to be presented with closing arguments with very contrasting theories, and they're going to have to pick. And you really want to have built that credibility and that trust with the jury throughout, so that they do tend to believe what your theory of the case is. And again, I think the disingenuous nature of painting the crowd, for example, trying to paint the crowd as being equivalent to being in a gunfight, or this idea that Chauvin was in some way trying to care for George Floyd. Yesterday we heard testimony from a defense witness that about George Floyd should have been resting comfortably. These are things that are going to undermine your credibility with the jury and impact how they see your case overall.
So where is that line as a defense lawyer between trying to present the strongest case for your client as you can and passing over into what you called sort of disingenuous line of argument?
I think the reality is that it is your job to present the best possible case for your client, and having it be a disingenuous argument doesn't help that. There is a way to defend this case that really, would reflect that this is a tragedy. There would have been a way, really, for the defense to approach this as a tragedy and as and to still present their theory that Chauvin didn't cause George Floyd's death. They've chosen not to do that. They've chosen to really take this line of attack, which has, really, quite frankly, racist undertones, and has just portrayed as really disingenuous. So we'll just have to wait and see how it plays out with the jury.
Right, how they respond. So do you believe at this point it would be appropriate for Derek Chauvin himself to testify, or do you believe he would do more harm than good to his case?
It's a really difficult question, and I think for any defense attorney and for any client, it's a question you're revisiting throughout the trial process, and certainly right before you would make that choice. I would have thought going into this that he probably would not have testified, but as I've listened to the testimony of the witnesses and quite frankly listened to his defense attorney question those witnesses and try and portray this their theory being that that Chauvin was acting in this environment that he sort of is comparing to a gunfight, and really trying to portray Derek Chauvin as providing care. It's difficult to see how he can accomplish that without putting Derek Chauvin on the stand. That being said, it's very risky, and so it's hard to say at this point what they're going to do.
All right. Well, Sarah Davis, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.